How's everyone doing? Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I know that this is not your normal night to meet up, so but I was here and I was like, hey, it'd be really cool to meet up with some folks in Atlanta while I'm here. And so I reached out. Actually, Zach was the one that connected me to the group, so thank you to him for helping to make this happen. So for those of you that don't know, my name is Stephen Fluin. I lead developer relations on the Angular team at Google. So there's kind of two parts to my job. So the first is to help developers and organizations be successful with Angular. And the second part is to understand what it's like being a real developer. So I know what it's like when someone asks you, do you test your software? So I spent about 15 years out in the real world doing consulting. I was kind of a rent-a-CTO for large companies, small companies, mid-sized companies, trying to help them understand how to use technology to the greatest effect. And so I continue that today on the Angular team. I live in Mountain View, or I work in Mountain View out in California, so working at the Google headquarters. And the Angular team is like a really, really cool team because we get to do everything basically open source. We can ignore most of Google whenever we want to, and then we can be a part of Google when it makes sense. And so I'm very lucky to do a lot of fun things. So I lead our experts program. So we have a set of certified Google developer experts, or GDEs, that we kind of certified in different technologies like Angular. We have a bunch of enterprise relationships. We have a bunch of partnerships with companies like Webpack and NativeScript and all those things. So I just get to talk really cool technology with people and build cool things all day. So I definitely love my job. So we're going to go through this in kind of three sections. First, we'll talk a little bit about Angular today. Then we will take a look at some of the things that have come out recently. And then I'll do a little bit of a demo of some of those things. And then I want to give you a glimpse into some of the things that are coming down the pipeline in terms of the future of Angular. So before we even get started, how many people here have written an Angular app? Okay, so that's a great question. So we use two terms very intentionally. So we talk about AngularJS, meaning 1.x and before. And we talk about Angular as 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And we came up with these terms because we had this decision that we're going to be doing every 6 months. We're going to do a major release, and then we're going to follow semantic versioning, so you can always tell exactly what our version numbers mean and why we're incrementing them. Sure. So for those of you who don't know, so we released version 2 of Angular, and then we released version 4 of Angular, and we skipped 3. So we had, so Angular is actually made up of a bunch of different packages on NPM. And one of the packages, we'd gone through an extra revision on it, which was our router. And so as of version 2 of most of the Angular kind of packages on NPM, we were at version 3 of the router. And so in order to follow semantic versioning, every time we made an update, we'd have to update them all by 1. So then you'd be on Angular version 3, router version 4, and we didn't want that. And so we just skipped a version, and now they're all synced up. The other joke reason is that we said there'd never be an Angular 3, right? Because going from AngularJS, the 1.x to Angular, there's a bit of a transition, right? It's the same philosophies, but a lot of times you have to migrate your code. You have to do a bunch of work to make that happen. And so people were asking us after we released kind of version 2, they're like, oh, is there going to be an Angular 3 where I'm going to have to rewrite my app? And we said, no, there's not. And so now we fulfilled that promise. We skipped version 3. Did that? Okay, so now I'll ask again. So how many people have worked with AngularJS? So 1.x. Okay, about half the group here. And then how many people have worked with Angular? The same people. Very nice. All right, so there's a few people here that have not yet built an Angular app, so I'll just briefly kind of make sure that we're all on the same page. So I really like to talk about our values as a team, because this is kind of informs a lot of what we do. And so we talk about on the team valuing apps that users love to use, apps that developers love to build, and a community where everyone feels welcome. Apps that users love to use is actually a really important thing, because a lot of developers, they're really focused on their business needs, they're really focused on the features that their boss is telling them to do, and oftentimes it's very easy to forget that we're building these applications for users. These are the reasons that we're all here. And so we spend a lot of time trying to make things like usability easy, accessibility, internationalization, just saying, hey, how can we better serve the users from a performance standpoint, from a loading experience? How can we give users subtle hints as to what's going on in the application? And so we focus a lot on making you as developers more effective at serving your users. But at the same time, you have to be effective, and you have to feel like you're confident, you understand what's going on. And so developer experience is also very key for us. And lastly, Angular would not be as successful, we would not be where we are today, without a huge community of people doing things like building component libraries, building tooling, trying out crazy things with our compiler. And so a big part of why Angular is successful is because we have this giant community of educators, of YouTubers, all these sorts of things. So I talk about Angular being a platform that makes it easy to build applications of the web. If you contrast AngularJS to Angular, we used to call AngularJS a platform, or excuse me, a framework, but now we talk about Angular as being a platform. And this really reflects the fact that we broadened our focus from just building kind of the view layer into understanding the entire developer experience. And so this is why we're taking on things like, how do you scaffold out a new application? How do we apply best practices? How do we build and serve these applications in production? So we have a kind of a much broader focus on the things that matter to you as a developer. We also talk about building applications with the web, because not all Angular applications are served via an HTTP server. We see that a lot of companies and a lot of teams are building things like shipping them with Electron, so you can get a nice desktop application, either shipping them with NativeScript or Ionic, so you get a mobile installed experience. And so all these things are going to take your web technology skills and experience and take them further. And this is a theme that we're going to kind of hear a lot about. Angular has a ton of momentum right now. So at the end of last year, we talked about having over 1 million Angular developers. So this is actually kind of a lower bound. So we don't actually know how many Angular developers there are out in the world, because from a lot of anecdotal evidence, most Angular apps are not consumer facing. They're not on the public web. So when we go and talk to Tesla, most of their Angular apps are not for serving Tesla.com. They're for managing their manufacturing process. It's for understanding inventory, for doing payroll, for reviewing design systems, those sorts of things. And so because all these things are behind the firewall, we don't know they're there. And so we can't actually get metrics on those things. But anecdotally, it's probably about 90% of Angular apps are behind the firewall. And so we use our docs traffic as a stand-in to try and understand, okay, how big is the community, or at least what's a lower bound on the community in terms of who's accessing our docs. And then this year we hit another big milestone. So at the end of last year, we were 1 million 30-day actives. We just hit 1.4. So kind of very, very amazing growth. Angular is bigger than AngularJS ever was already, and it's continuing this kind of huge exponential trajectory that we're very happy to see. We have a lot of really awesome meetups worldwide. So over 790 meetups that have Angular in their name or are focused on Angular. So anytime I travel, I say, hey, who's the local Angular meetup? So thank you for having me. Angular is really focused on being kind of an integrated, having an integrated set of tools where we have an opinion about a lot of the different things that make you effective as developers. Everything from a CLI that helps you kind of automate your workflow to handling common tasks like router or HTTP, how to take user input, how to have a conversation, how to apply animations to create like delight and improve usability of your application. All of these things are designed in a way that you're going to get them by default. They're going to work really well, but we're opinionated in terms of giving them to you, but we are not forcing you to use them. Any of these things, you can swap them out. You can use Redux with Angular. You can create your own animations. You can do your own forms. You can really do whatever you want. But the nice thing is, because we have this standardized set of integrated tools, whenever you onboard a new Angular developer, they're probably going to know the same stack. And the application that they build is going to look very familiar to the application that you'd be building. And this actually is a really big deal when you're onboarding people onto new projects, because people change companies, all those sorts of things. We also talk about Angular as being all about kind of scaling. And so one of the ways that we scale is not just in terms of users, but it's also in terms of team composition. So Angular has been designed in a way to really encourage collaboration. So when you look at an Angular application, we've got this thing called modules, which you could think about as being the architectural level of an app. What's the structure? How are the different pieces fitting together? Then you can focus more on maybe just kind of a lower level developer who can just focus on a single experience, a single component, a single page. Then you can even pull in designers. So if your designers know HTML or CSS, you can point them directly at those files in the project, and they can be effective without having to see and modify and understand all of the rest of the application. This is something that we're kind of doubling down on, and I'll cover that a little bit in the future section. The last thing that Angular is really trying to do is to help you reach further. So I talked about this idea that we work with, not all web applications are shipping on the web, but the Angular team has this idea that you can keep building your Angular application, but then we can take your Angular application to new places. And so how many people know what a PWA is, or progressive web application? Awesome. So a progressive web application is it's basically a new type of application that you can build that's built on top of a set of new browser APIs. And the kind of most significant of those browser APIs are, one of them is called a service worker. So now in the web, in your web browser, this works today across virtually all the browsers, if you visit a website, they are allowed to install something on your computer. It's called a service worker, and that service worker has a couple superpowers. One of the kind of most visible superpowers is that service worker can proxy every network request that your application makes. And the magic here is that because we can proxy all the HTTP requests, I can make a web application work offline after the first visit. Right? So if you visit the Angular.io website on your phone and then kill the network connection, the next time you try and go to it, it should still work, assuming you gave it the 5 or 6 seconds it takes to actually download and cache the application. And this is kind of an amazing thing for web developers because the web continues to get better and we can deliver better experiences in low network connectivity environments, all those sorts of things. Another superpower that comes with service workers is the ability to do push notifications. So we've probably all seen the, do you want to allow this website to send you push notifications? That's a superpower that you have to use a service worker to actually access. And if you go into the developer tools over into the application tab in Chrome, and you click all sites, you'll actually see that basically on average, I see at least 10 or 12 different service workers installed on people's computers that they never even knew that they were using. And this is because the browsers have done such a good job of making these APIs accessible in a secure and safe way that doesn't let the website get any privilege escalation or anything like that. We're also working very closely with the NativeScript team, with our idea being that you can just kind of take an Angular application that you've built, either from scratch or an existing one, and then add in NativeScript to do mobile targeting with native UI widgets. So they actually just shipped in the last few weeks this idea about a hybrid application. And so you can ng add a bunch of things for, I think it's at NativeScript/Schematics. What will happen is you will then be able to build for the web, you'll be able to build for mobile, and then you'll be using the right set of HTML, the right templates at the right time. I mentioned Electron for desktop. And the last one is Elements. And so there's another browser standard that's becoming more and more popular called Custom Elements. This is kind of a standardized set of componentry for the web. And what it means is that you can take any Angular component from your Angular application and package it in a way that's redistributable, that uses the browser for bootstrapping instead of relying on a framework. And so this is really good for kind of small pieces of UI, UX, not necessarily as good for overall orchestration. And that's one of the things that Angular is very good at. So let's dive into a little about what's new. So over the last few months, we've had a couple big releases. So we had our 6.0 release, and then just last month, we had the 6.1 release. So the 6.0 release was really focused on this idea of stability and balancing stability and innovation. So taking the applications that you build and the skills that you already have, and then automatically updating them, automatically keeping them fresh. And so the first command that we released, this was part of our CLI, is called ng-update. So a lot of us have done the kind of standard web developer technique of I update my NPM dependencies, and then I go and fix whatever broke in my application. Has anyone done this before? Yeah. This is how you do it, right? And then if there's an error, you Google the error, then you find the migration guide, and you follow the migration guide. But the Angular team thinks we can do a little bit better than that. And so what we've done is we've used our CLI, and we've used a technology that we built called Schematics to allow dependencies to update your application for you. And so there's a couple examples of this. So if you run ng-update at Angular/core to get up to version 6, to get up to version 6.1 or 7 when that comes out, we're actually going to do a bunch of things under the hood. So we're going to update everything as what's called our package group. So core, common, compiler. So all of those pieces of the Angular framework side of things that have to be kept kind of in sync, or you want to keep them in sync, we're going to do all of those automatically because we know about them. And then we're going to go ahead and look at all of the peer dependencies. So the Angular team will use peer dependencies instead of dependencies because otherwise you get this kind of hierarchical structure where two things have asked for different versions and then you never know how to debug and it's a complete mess. So we use peer dependencies for most things, which actually makes updating in general a little bit harder, but it means that your project structure overall is much cleaner. But now with ng-update, we're going to take care of that automatically. So we'll update our XJS, zones, TypeScript, all of those dependencies. But in each of these packages, we're also looking to see if they have any ng-update scripts that we want to run. And so for example, when you run ng-update at Angular/core, when we update our XJS to version 6, for example, there were a ton of breaking changes. They got rid of something like 80%, or they changed 80% of their API surface. So we know that that's painful for developers. So as part of the RxJS update to 6, we'll automatically install a compatibility package that keeps your code working. And so this is a philosophy that we think the community should definitely kind of adopt, where if you're building a component library that other people are consuming, or you're providing a dependency for someone, you should automatically update when you need to make breaking changes. And so this is something we're embodying to try and help developers stay as up-to-date as possible. Another one along the very same lines, using schematics under the hood, is ng-add. So ng-add, it does a very similar thing where we're going to go download some packages from npm, but then under the hood we're going to actually install those packages into your application in a way that's prescribed by the specific use case. So for example, if I ng-add @angular/pwa, I'm going to turn my app into a PWA. If I ng-add ng-bootstrap, it's going to not only install the npm package, but it's also going to set up my application module so that I can start using that very quickly. And so this is really designed to be an open platform so that any package on the internet could specify how it should be installed, and then kind of automate and abstract away that first page of that getting started guide where you just type the 7 things that it tells you to type. Right? We want to just automate that so you don't have to do that anymore. This is all done under the hood with a tool called Schematics. So Schematics is actually what we use when you do ng-new or ng-generate. And it's not just kind of file level scaffolding where we're just copying files. It actually is a full platform for modifying projects. So for example, when you run ng-new, we take an empty tree and we return you a full tree. But you can do really intelligent things like you can query backend APIs to understand maybe like a service that you want to access, and then you could scaffold out a local service based on that backend API. So there's really sophisticated things you can do, and we're just starting to see the potential of schematics. So if you wanted to do this, for example, if you wanted to add an ng-update schematic to your application or to your dependency, you just throw this into your package.json that says, hey, I support ng-update. Here's my collection of schematics. And then you say, here's my schematic. You specify the version number where we apply this, and then you specify the factory, which is just the name of the schematic that we're going to run. Very similarly for ng-add, you basically just add a schematic called ng-add, and then we'll automatically run that whenever a user asks for you. I talked a little bit about Angular Elements and this idea that we've got a new set of componentry that now is kind of native in the browser. And so we want to kind of wholeheartedly adopt this wherever it makes sense to. And I'll give a really good example. So on Angular.io, we have a lot of documentation. And embedded in the content of our doc site is code samples. And we want those code samples to be enriched by functionality. And so you have this kind of fundamental tension between content and code, where we always try and keep those very separate in Angular because anytime content can escape into code, that's where you get security problems. But the way that we were having to enrich the content on Angular.io was we would dynamically bootstrap components on top of it. But by now shipping those kind of code sample like live previews as Angular elements, as custom elements that the browser knows how to bootstrap, we're actually kind of delegating that problem to the browser, so you don't have the security problems and you don't have to do any of the wiring manually. So we're taking advantage of the browser's capabilities. So Angular Elements works really well today in the context of an Angular application, and we're looking towards a future where you can actually just build an Angular element and then give it to someone else. You can give it to your React developers, your Vue developers, and they can use that as a web standard custom element in their app. We also added support for ng-generate library. So this was a really often requested feature so that you could actually follow best practices in terms of building a component library that's distributable on NPM. So we added that. We were actually using a open source contributor. So this David Hergis built ng-packager. And so we actually worked with him to bring that into the CLI as a first party thing. We added a bunch of features to Angular Material. So we now have tree structures. We have this nice bottom sheet. So if you on iOS or Android have seen like that share menu pop up, we have a component for that now, as well as for badges. So now flashing forward a little bit to 6.1, so this was just the release that came out a couple weeks ago. We added a new feature to our router that restores scroll position. Hooray, we should have had this from the beginning, but software's hard. So right now you can opt into it, so you just say scroll position restoration enabled, and then that will become default in the future, but we didn't want to break people's apps again, so having this nice, slow evolution. We also implemented Shadow DOM v1. Does anyone know what Shadow DOM is? Okay, so as you may know, there was the Shadow DOM v0 spec that Chrome implemented and was a big deal for a long time. And then all the browser vendors got together and implemented or decided on a real specification, and that was called Shadow DOM v1. And so now we support Shadow DOM v1. This won't affect most developers' lives unless you are building a component library or you're taking advantage of this extensively. We also added a key value pipe. So this was something that we had in AngularJS that is now landing in Angular, where normally in ng4 always in ng4 expects an iterable, like an array. But now what you can do is you can pipe an object or a map or dictionary into key value, and then that will turn that map or dictionary into an array of key value pairs. All right, should we jump into a demo? All right, so my goal here is we're going to start with the CLI. So I already did the npm installs. Hopefully that doesn't fail. It always fails. We'll see. I want to use, so I've run ng add at Angular/material, so I'll show you what one of the things that gave us, which is called these starter components. And then I'll go ahead and I'll switch around the router. I'll show you guys Shadow DOM. I'll show you guys how to create a lazy loaded route. And then we'll add a library. Sound good? Yeah. Sure. So you as a developer that wants to take advantage of PWAs or material, you run ng add at Angular/material or ng add at Angular/PWA, and we will run everything for you. The idea behind schematics is that it's not magic, it's not custom code, it's something that anyone could create for themselves. So for example, if you're working on a component library that you have a whole team of people using, you could add a schematic to your package that makes it really easy for them to adopt it. So part of my job is talking to a lot of companies that use Angular, and basically every company has a component library. Every single one, whether they know it or not, they have a component library. Hopefully they just have one, but the bigger the company, the more likely they have 2 or 3 or 4. And so anytime we can empower the component library authors to be more collaborative and to decrease the friction of adoption, this is a really good thing. One of the examples that we talk about a lot is VMware. So they have a component library, they have a design system, and they wanted people to use their design system. They wanted all of VMware to look the same. And so they actually open sourced it and then added a bunch of Angular components, with the idea being that if we make it really easy for people to use our design system, if it's actually the easiest way to build out a new experience, people are going to use it, and then we're going to achieve the standardization. And I love that story because they open sourced it so that partners could use it as well. So if you are building something on top of VMware's platform that's going to be part of the experience, you can use the open source component library, and then everything looks cohesive for the end users. Any other questions before I dive in? All right, let's give this a try. So before I got here, I ran ng add at Angular/material, and that added, updated my package JSON, it added themes, it updated my app module to import some things. We can try. Is that any better? Yes? Okay. Awesome. So it imports the themes, it modifies your index.html. So all the kind of little getting started steps for adding Angular material to a project, we've done that for you. But one of the cool things, actually before we do this, let me just make sure that this app works. Welcome to Atlanta JS. Hooray! So this is what you get kind of out of the box whenever you ng new a new project. And adding Angular material doesn't actually change anything out of the box in terms of the user experience. But now I should be able to do something like ng generate at Angular/material, material dashboard, name equals dashboard. So what I'm doing now is I'm using a schematic that was created by Angular material and added to my project to create what we're calling starter components. So the idea is, instead of starting from a blank canvas for building out your application, we want to give you some of the best practices for how to actually use Angular material. And so you see it created a new component called dashboard.component, and it added it to my app module. And if we take a look at the code, I'll make it big in a second here. We now have our dashboard component. If we look at the HTML, it'll just get dark. So we're going to have to wave your arms. So building out a dashboard is actually, it's a relatively complex thing, right? Because you want to have these action bars, and you want to have menus, and you want to have cards, and you want to have grids. So you could do this all yourself, or you just run this run command, and we'll give you a kind of starter component. So this one's called app dashboard, I believe. So yep, app dashboard. So it's what it created automatically for me. And if we just go into our app component, we blow this away. We say app dashboard. We save that. we now have a pre-created dashboard for us. So it's got little drop-down menus for actions. It's got, you can see the grid layout, so you can size things as appropriately. Yeah, so that is one of the starter components. There's two others that I'll create here. So I'll just ng generate another one called side nav. I always forget this one. My apologies. All right, material nav. So that's created a nav component. So now we can swap this one out with app-nav. And now we have a side drawer. And this is responsive. So if I switch over into a mobile perspective, it comes with all the functionality. You can open, you can close it. All the things you'd expect from a side navigation, kind of pre-configured for you, pre-wired up with all the behavior and functionality. The last one to show off is at Angular/material table. Thanks VS Code for the extra character. You're the best. All right, so we'll jump back to desktop view here, just give it a little bit more space. And you can see that we've got a table here. Oh, and one thing I didn't do is I didn't restart the serve command. So because we updated our Angular JSON, we actually added the theme. I have to reserve. So you can see this is what it looks like unstyled. And let's see what it looks like if the theme actually works. CSS, you can just, all right, well, I'll just skip that for now. All right, so yeah, question? Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. So we intentionally called it a starter component because you can do whatever you want with this code. It's really just to show you if you want something out of the box, here is an example. And then you can throw it all away, you can ignore it, you never have to generate one of these. It just shows you one way of combining all of these kind of different capabilities we're offering. So you could build your own mat table from scratch. Like I could pull up the Material Angular.io website, follow all the steps, figure out how do I nest these things, how do I wire them all up. But the idea is everyone's going to want something different, but we'll give you a default that's pretty good. And one of the cool things about table is that you saw those data items. We've actually created not just the component itself, but also a data source. So this is just kind of a self-documented version of here's how you get the data, here's how you connect to a data source. And so if you have paginated data, if you want to pull this data in from the web based on user interactions, all of that is relatively straightforward here, just using this data source API. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's more generic AST parsing. So in the Angular material schematics, they've said, hey, go add this to the app module. So they explicitly said, add this import, add this ES 2015 import, add this ng module import. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so now I'm going to blow this away. Now I want to do routing. So I want to show you how routing can be done, because one of the big challenges when we focus on user experience is that a lot of our applications, when we start building bigger and bigger apps, there's too much code and it actually slows down the user, because for the app to load, it has to load everything at once. And so we've kind of baked in lazy loading into the way that we think about Angular applications, and we do it by splitting on the module levels via the router. So based on what URL the user is requesting, we're going to serve a bunch of different chunks, and the browser is only going to request the chunks that they need to run that route. And so to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a few new components. So I'll generate a home component. I will generate a about module. And then I'm going to go into the about module, and I'm going to generate a about component. So this is an example of the schematics. Oh, I have to tell it to generate something. This is an example of the schematics being intelligent, where if I'm in the about module from a file system standpoint, it's going to add it to the about module instead of the app module. So it's actually kind of aware of where the nearest module is and trying to infer that for you. You can also just be explicit and say add it to this module or that module. All right, so let's jump back into ngserve here. So I now have home, I have about, which is another module. So let's go ahead and add the router. So I'm going to jump into my app module. So I'm going to just add the router. So this is what you would do anytime you wanted to have a URL mapping into a set of components. So I import the router module. Say router module.forRoot, because we're at the root of the application, and I would pass it an array of routes. So we'll just give it one route for now. We'll say path any. It's going to take us to the component known as home component. All right. And then for this route to actually work, we have to render it to the screen by a router outlet. So router outlet tells the application where it should actually be rendering the route based on the URL state. So if we've done this correctly, when I go to the home page, it should say homeworks. So it saw that we're at the blank route and said, let's render the home component. I'm just going to add a quick navigation here. So let's say div a router link equals blank. So this will take us home. And then we'll have one for about. So we could just synchronously refer to all of our components just in the same way that we did here with take a path, refer to a component. But there's a special thing you can do between modules, which is called load children. So in our about module, we're going to add the router. And then what we'll do is we will configure it for child. And again, we'll pass an array of routes, and this one will just be blank. We'll route to the about component. And the magic here is in our parent router, what we can do is we can actually say for any path that has about in it, don't route synchronously to a component, let's route indirectly to the about module. So let's do about.module, pound about module. And so this load children command is actually telling the application this is a lazy loading boundary split or a chunking split, so that it knows that this module is separate and can be generated separately by the CLI and then loaded whenever the user only goes to the about module here. So let's see if that worked. All right, so we can see in our ngserve, it generated a new chunk here. So we have our main chunk and then we have our about module chunk. And then we can see homeworks, and here's the magic moment. And it didn't work. Demo gods are not favoring me tonight. Zach, GDE powers? What'd I miss? We have that one. Nope. That should have just been a symbol reference. Here, let's create another component. Just make sure we're not crazy. Turn it off, turn it on again. Is that what you're saying? Does anyone have one of those MIB like flashers? Just forget the last couple of minutes here. All right. think it's fine. But we just turned off and on serving, so maybe, hey, about works. It was off. I had to just turn it off and on again. It's always the answer. All right, so let's blow this up so you can actually see what's going on. So when I go to Home, and we load the application, you can see that we've got this main bundle. That's probably too big. Can you still see it there? All right, but when the user within the same application without reloading goes to the About context, we know that we have to go lazy load this module. And so you can actually lazy load basically everything in your application that takes all of the modules, all of the code in your app out of the critical path. So if I go to /about, it knows it needs it, even just to start, and goes and gets it. And it's intelligent, so if you go to Home and About, it's not re-downloading that, right? Now, once it has it, it knows about it. So the load children. So we use our router to tell Webpack what the chunks are. We are doing an analysis of the routes and then telling Webpack what the chunks are, what the entry points of the application are. So under the hood, yep. Yes. Yeah. And so the big deal about this is it's not just your code, it's all the dependencies. So let's imagine that we created an admin module that needed an extra database access handler and a bunch of business rules and a nice what you see is what you get editor. All those things can be included in that lazy loaded module instead of your root module. So you can pay for only what you use as part of the user experience. Yeah. Sure. So there's no functional difference. If you use the CLI and do -- routing or -- routes or whatever the flag is, it will put your routes in a separate file. Personally, I always just put it directly in my app module. And the reason I have that personal preference is because you already have to have all the imports for the declarations. And so if you already have the imports, why are you duplicating all those in another file? It just feels simpler to me, but it also depends on the complexity of the module, right? Like, so this module is starting to get to a level where I might want to abstract out some of these dependencies into another file to keep this very clean and explicit about what it's doing. So I mean, this is just kind of a natural elaboration of structure as your application gets bigger, you want to have fewer things in each piece. Yeah. Yeah. So as part of the Angular PWA support, we actually we generate a manifest based on all the files emitted by Webpack. And so you can decide. You can say, hey, go and load all of these and cache them all as part of the service worker. You can say only load them once a user has requested them. So it's up to you in terms of the experience you're running the build. All right, so let's do one last thing here. So I'm going to say ng-generate library, and we'll just call it mylib. -- name equals mylib. Let's try that. The demo gods are not favoring me today. What's going on? All right, I was in the wrong folder. So you do ng-generate library, and we're automatically going to create a projects folder for you. This is configurable in the Angular JSON. We're going to give you the testing configuration. We're going to give you the ng package config. We're going to give it its own package JSON, so when you distribute it to NPM, it's separate from your application. And really just trying to give you all of the best practices out of the box, so that when you do ng build mylib, everything works So I'm going to jump over to the last section of the presentation here. We did it! Hooray! Oh, did you want to see Shadow DOM? It's not super exciting. Who wants to see Shadow DOM? All right, we'll do the 30-second version. So I've got an app component. This app component is just using Angular view encapsulation. So if I have a CSS, all of my CSS is going to be scoped to that component via Angular adding extra tags to that HTML component. But we can say encapsulation is now view encapsulation dot shadow DOM. So when we look at our application, if we ng-serve again, so the way it worked before, let's just put this on the side. Hooray! So before, we attached all of the CSS via this ng-host-c0, and then we added the same thing to the CSS that applied to it directly. And you can see this is just a normal HTML. So CSS can pierce anywhere up and down, which is kind of what CSS was designed to do, but it gives you a poor isolation of each component. Now if we refresh, because the CLI is done, what we should see under app root is now we have a shadow root. So now we're taking advantage of Shadow DOM and the kind of newer specs in the browser to do that encapsulation. So the style tag that lives in here will never leak because it's scoped to that shadow root. That's Shadow DOM. All right, now on to the more interesting stuff. The future! So one of the things that we really want to do is bring the best of Google out to the rest of the world. So Google's pretty good at building software. We have tens of thousands of engineers. We've got lots and lots of machines, lots and lots of lines of source code. We build a lot of software. And so we have really good tools internally to make that scalable, to make that manageable. So for example, all code at Google is written in a single source code repository. And so we've got really good tools, really good processes to manage that. I can go into that for hours. But one of the tools that we're doing is we're actually trying to open source all of those things. So Bazel is our build system that we use within Google. It's open source. You can take advantage of it. And we're working to bring that into our CLI so that the CLI is using the same thing within Google that you use outside of Google. We just launched a couple new cool products. So if you are using Bazel, for example, you can now do your builds in the cloud. So we announced remote build execution, or RBE. So when you do like an ng build, imagine it spinning up a server farm instead of using your local machine to build out your 10 million line application. We really love this idea of monorepositories in terms of how they can increase your agility. So the example I always go to is Heartbleed SSL bug that happened a bunch of years ago. Because Google has a monorepository and we only had one version of SSL across the entire company, we patched it in one place, and within a week, basically all of Google was protected. This is not a level of agility that you get when you have 100 different repositories with 100 different teams that all have to patch their open SSL. Yeah. You don't clone it. So we have really sophisticated tools where you basically, we have a virtual file system that just gives you access to the subsets you want. Home rolled, but I mean, the Angular team, we're slowly building like a public monorepository where we just use Git and GitHub. So like there's really cool tools like pull approve now, where you can segment your application and say like these people have approval ownership of these parts of our code, these other people have approval access to those parts of the code. And then I mean, a lot of it's just like philosophies. So if I break your code and your tests in Google, I have to fix it. But if I break your code but I don't break your tests, you have to fix it. And so it actually leads to a lot higher quality development, kind of this idea of defensive testing, all these sorts of things, so that anyone in the company can have a cool idea and get it out very, very quickly, being absolutely certain that they're not going to break the world. We've also announced that we're working on something called Angular for Designers. So designer means something different to everyone, but anyone that is focused on the kind of visual side of Angular, we have a bunch of initiatives around this to try and make Angular simpler for those folks, because maybe they don't want to go install NPM and Node and all these tools, but they still want to be participating in the same application so they can make tweaks, they can make improvements. We're also working, not our team, but actually the Google Cloud team are working on a prototyping tool that takes in real components and gives you a drag and drop interface. The idea being here that it eliminates the uncanny valley between what a designer might create in something like Sketch and what a developer has to build and how it will actually work for users. So this is really good for UX research, for doing usability studies, because you can very quickly scaffold out an experience, bind it to some data, and it's going to work and function just like the real thing. You're not going to have to kind of rethink through all of those experiences. And then one of the last things I'll talk about here is Ivy. So under the hood, Angular is going through a bunch of refactors that are improving the way that Angular is built itself. And so none of these will all be 100% backward compatible. So at some point, we will just flip a switch, and then all of your code will get better. And the big kind of mental shift here in terms of how we do Angular is, right now, we have a compilation step that turns your HTML templates into kind of an intermediate set of code. And then we have a runtime that runs your code. It says, hey, should I run the pipe code? And then run your pipe code. Should I run your dependency injection code? Then runs your code. And what we're doing is we're flipping that mental model so that your code is actually going to be invoking the Angular pieces it needs. And so what this will do is it'll dramatically increase the, or decrease the bundle size, so increase performance for users by only including the parts of Angular that you actually use. And the other piece of this is called locality. And so your code will basically, you can compile a component, you can compile a module without having to know about the entire world. And so this will make incremental rebuilds much, much faster as well. So our hello world right now is 3 KB. So if you did this with the CLI with the full kind of everything you need in Angular, it'd be about 150 KB. So we're pretty happy with these results. And we're pretty assured that this isn't going to grow too much, because as long as the hello world doesn't change and invoke more code, right? The hello world binding code is done. Now we just need to kind of finish up the rest of the world. So where we're at in terms of the kind of Ivy roadmap is the compiler is virtually done. We're working on the runtime right now. So what if I have an internationalization call? What if I have an animations call? How do all these things execute in the runtime? So we're continuing to work on that today. This will be released at some point after 7. I won't commit to any sort of version number. But the idea is once we can flip a switch and all of the applications within Google work without anyone changing a single line of code, then we'll be confident enough that we can just flip the switch for everyone out in the open source world. Obviously, you'll be able to opt in before that, so that we've got this kind of verification stage that we're going through. But this really underscores this idea that we want Angular to get better while you keep building the same apps, right? We want you to use your knowledge, keep doing things the same way that you learned when you learned Angular, and we're going to take your applications further, and we're going to make your code and your user experience better. Thank you so much. So no, because dependency injection would actually be optional. So I guess I can see the similarities between what you, like only injecting what you need. Dependency injection is actually problematic because for dependency injection systems to work, everything has to be available. And so dependency injection in some ways breaks tree shaking. This is why one of the things that we landed in, I think it was 6.0, was what we call tree shakeable providers or tree shakeable services. So if you scaffold out a service after 6.0, you'll see the @injectable decorator. It'll say provide in root. And what that does is it actually flips and inverts the model. So that in that way, it is very similar, where instead of your module providing all of the things that anyone could ever need, we tell the module how to provide itself. And then the moment someone uses that service in a component or in a module, then we'll automatically add it to the dependency injection system. So those concepts are very, very similar. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. So there is a help that shows you all of the commands. We are working on a complete overhaul of the CLI documentation that will be integrated into Angular.io. So historically, it was a separate wiki in GitHub that didn't have all the details you'd need, but we're doing a full kind of documentation process so that all these things will be documented on Angular.io. Yes, yeah, we definitely want to fix that. So I think if we pull up the Angular CLI, we do have a wiki here. Go to the right link. That they're trying to document all of those options, but we know it's not good enough. So theoretically, if we go into one of these commands like ng-generate, it should show you all the available options, all the flags that you can throw. So the first step was trying to enumerate these. So here's all the flags you can run on ng-generate component. So we have a list now. Now we want to make it actually useful and helpful. Yeah. Sure. 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 So have you seen ng-generate universal? Okay. So universal is something that works pretty okay today, but obviously it sounds like you're running into more advanced. I mean, the general strategy for server-side rendering with Angular is Angular works really well. You just have to get the bundle in the right format. And so when you do ng-generate universal, we create a project that you can run in Node, or a binary that you can run in Node that basically includes your Angular application. And then you're responsible for giving it a document and any of the parameters the user requested, and then you get basically back a string, and then you can cache that, you can give that to users, whatever you want. So I'd love to hear more if you're having challenges, but I will say we're actually building more tooling around Universal right now to handle more advanced use cases. So one of those advanced use cases is entirely kind of new lazy load or server-side rendering strategy, which just launched on express.google.com. You heard of Shopping Express? So this is an Angular app that they've just added server-side rendering into it. And what we do here is the new strategy that we're leaning towards is, so we server-side render the application, and then in the background, we download the JavaScript, all the things that you need to actually run it to make it rich and interactive. And then what happens is on first navigation, if the app is loaded, then we just swap it out. If it hasn't loaded, then we just do another server-side render of the application. And then for any piece of functionality you need in the first render, we're using Angular elements so that we're using custom elements to bootstrap those so you don't have to send down the full application. So this works within Google now. You could do it yourself. I mean, there's nothing stopping you. We just want to make tools that make this easy. Sure. Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, definitely, if you're running into challenges, either file an issue, let me know, because we definitely care about any rough spots within Angular. I mean, we are open source first, right? We do all of our development on GitHub in the public with the community, and then we sync back into Google to validate the quality of commits and the quality of releases. So it's kind of nice. Like if a community contributor writes a really cool patch, we can tell immediately, is this going to break anyone's app? And then we can either fix it, tweak it, give feedback, decide not to merge it, those sorts of things, because we have this big suite of 800 plus applications built in our mono repository. Awesome. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll just be, oh, sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. So the happy path depends on your application. We actually have a team member that's working right now. She's about to launch in the next 3 weeks a new tool. It's a couple new things. So she's going to launch an analysis tool that takes a look at your AngularJS app and makes a recommendation about a path. Just like what anti-patterns are you using, what patterns are you using, how big is your code base, things like are you using TypeScript, are you using root scope, are you in components, or are you in scope and controllers? It just uses that as a heuristic to say, hey, we think this might be a good path for you. And the other thing that she's launching is a new community site so that people can collaborate on sharing tools, best practices, things they've figured out about the update process. But I'll generally say there's 3 ways to get from AngularJS to Angular. You can use ng upgrade, which allows you to basically bootstrap AngularJS and Angular and then share components and services between the two. That's the kind of standard answer. This is what we do on Google Cloud Platform. So if you go to cloud.google.com, that is a very, very big kind of million-plus line of code AngularJS app that is now being migrated to Angular with hundreds of team members. And so they need the ability to have access to the same thing kind of from both worlds. So ng upgrade's very good. We're continuing to work on making it more performant, making it easier to use, those sorts of things. The other newer one is we actually see some teams using Angular elements. So instead of trying to convert your application, what if you built all of the new functionality as custom elements built in Angular, and then slowly more and more of your application became Angular until you could just drop the old stuff. And then the other way is just kind of the incremental rewrite. So just figure out the splits of your application. Maybe my home screen doesn't need to be AngularJS. Maybe that can be Angular, and then I can do a server-side render of whatever to get to the next place. Yep. Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, no. It's just, anytime we make a developer set up their own Webpack, I feel bad. Like, Webpack is a big giant pain, and we all got years of scars and legacy gulp scripts that we have to contend with, right? So I mean, one of the funny things I always say is that Angular apps day one look like a good AngularJS app looked after 2 or 3 months, right? Because you start very small, you throw the script tag at the top in your AngularJS app, and then you start binding things, and you start building controllers. But then by month 2 or 3, you want all these things uglified. You want them minified. You want it bundled properly. You want to automatically pull in assets. You want to transpile your Sass into CSS. Like, you want all of these things, but you had to do them manually in AngularJS. In Angular, we're doing all of them from day one. And so our project structure looks more complex, but it scales much, much better because we're following all the best practices from day one. You have an existing one for your AngularJS app. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, understand. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and there's also community tools. So there's NGX Build Plus, which actually lets you do any Webpack custom config you want. But most often what we see is that you use something like a CLI project for Angular. So you get Angular following all the best practices, and you can actually leave your AngularJS build almost virtually intact as whatever you're doing in Webpack, and then add that into the Angular app. So like import it, require it, move it into the assets folder. So you can have both build systems working together. But we can chat offline too. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for having me. It was a lot of fun, and I'll be around to answer questions.